What's up, guys?
It's Rowan
and Terry
here from Artismart TV, bringing you another episode
of the HSC Economics Review.
Now, in this episode, it is the first of a series we're doing on the federal budget and its impact on the Australian economy. Now, we know that in HSC Economics, one of the things you're going to have to do is analyse the impact of the budget on specific economic issues. And particularly, one of the things that I know, that we've seen and we've talked about on prior episodes before, is that often the analysis part of policy and the effectiveness of policy is where students tend to struggle a little bit. And it's also the opportunity where you can really differentiate yourself in those extended responses. So the focus of this episode is purely going to be on what is the current federal budget doing in terms of its policies for economic growth, and then look at what's the likely impact. Let's do some analysis together on what we think the impact's going to be, and you're going to have a bunch of analysis that you can then use to inform your take in your essays as well. So, Terry.
Yes, Ron.
Where do we want to start? Budget, economic growth, where should we be starting when we're looking at it?
That's a great point, Ron. So I think the most important thing is to understand that budgets are very, very heavily influenced by the context in which they're drafted up. And that's probably the first point I want to emphasize, is that there is always going to be a political influence, a bit of a political limitation. So bit of a small history lesson here, Ron, but as we know that this budget in 2023 and 2024, we can probably trace its beginnings back to 2020 and 2021, just when we had those very, very expansionary fiscal policies. We had the budgets for example, we had the $134 billion deficit, which was a 6.5% of GDP deficit, one of the largest we've had in history. Then we've kind of come out from that, and we actually came out very, very well, to the point where we had a surplus in last year's budget. In case you haven't heard, because the government has literally not stopped talking about it.
That's right. And I think what's interesting about that budget, it was originally $4.2 billion. Okay, that was originally what they had estimated. And this is the 2022-23 budget we're talking about. Now, it's turned out to be a lot larger than that. Yeah. Okay, it's turned out to be close to
$19 billion.
$19 billion. Now, that is quite significant. It's quite significant because, first of all, it's the first surplus that we've had for many, many, many years. In fact, it's the first surplus, I believe, that the Labor government have produced since Keating. Now, for those of you that, actually, most of you watching this probably weren't born.
Neither was I.
I was only just born, I think, then.
Yeah.
Keating was around in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, okay? So that's a long time that we haven't had a Labor government surplus budget.
And so if you're wondering, the most recent Liberal Party surplus was with John Howard. Scott Morrison thought he got very, very, very close in 2018-19, but they just missed out.
So in other words, surpluses are very rare, okay? They don't come around, and they're really important in terms of often the political capital that it can give parties. So we've seen a surplus occur in 2022-2023. Now, why are we talking as well about the year before? Well, ultimately, when we start to look at the economic impact of the 23-24 budget, we've got to consider it in the context of what came the year before, right?
And just before we dive into that, I just want to point out something about this $19 billion budget. So, first of all, yes, you can have a difference between what you plan for in the budget, because we need to remember that a budget is just a planned level of expenditure versus taxation revenue. And so they originally did plan for that 4.2 billion surplus. Why did it get up to 19 billion? Well, there's two main reasons. The first one is that people were actually working a lot more than originally anticipated, so that meant more income tax revenue coming in. And also just because of the way that inflation's been, people's incomes were actually a little bit higher, and because they hadn't adjusted the tax brackets, this is something called bracket creep. People had actually ended up getting into higher tax brackets, and there were more people working, so they were making a fair bit more in income tax. The other one was that we had the higher commodity prices, which, look, I'll be honest with you guys, the government doesn't have very much influence over. So, when we look at this as a victory, in terms of political capital and whatnot, we can look at it as a victory for the Albanese government, but we need to also understand that there was a bit of luck involved.
There was just some headwinds that they were taking advantage of, which is great, right? Like, it's great to see, that we've had both of those situations occurring, and we have, the surplus that's 19 billion from last year. Now, what is this year's, we've talked about last year's, let's move into the 2023-24 budget. What is that? Again, this is a predicted amount. We may very well find that in a year the different number. But for now, what are they predicting or projecting, I should say?
Yeah, so they're taking kind of that positivity and that good luck from last year, and they're going with probably not as large of, like a deficit as they probably would want, but they're probably hopefully optimistic about that they can achieve what they want without, I guess, further increasing our deficit. So we're looking at about a $13.9 billion deficit, which is a 0.5% of GDP.
So then that's all well and good, but now we've got to think about, and that's what we're looking at there is outcome, right? Which is, okay, let's look at just the sort of the numbers in terms of revenue and expenditure for the budget, right? What we've then got to think about is stance, and stance refers to the impact on the economy, particularly on economic growth. And when we look at the stance, what we want to look at here is the prior year as well, and understand, okay, what is the budget doing in the prior, and how does the overall outcome differ from the prior year? So we've had a surplus in the prior year, right? 19 billion. We've now got a deficit, at least a projected deficit for this year. So what that does is it makes it a mildly expansionary fiscal stance. Now, why is it mildly, right? Why is it mild? Why is it not aggressive?
Yeah, because as I said, Rowan, it's only a 0.5% of GDP, so it's not a tremendous amount. And I think it's important that when you do quote these, budget outcomes, that you look at it relative to GDP, because we could all get carried away. Oh my God, they're spending, 13.9 billion. That sounds great, but compared to the size of the Australian economy, it's really not that particularly large. And I think to what they're trying to achieve, I think they're obviously very cautious of the high levels of inflation we've had recently. I think we can't do a budget video without talking about that, right? They've had such high levels of inflation. We've peaked at 7.8% in Q4 of 2022. And so I guess they've just been a little bit cautiously optimistic and said, look, we're happy to spend a bit of money, but probably not trying to get too carried away with it.
That's right. And I think I would also not be surprised if there's also an expectation that they're predicting a budget that is in deficit, but it moves to a smaller deficit.
Or even
right?
a surplus.
Or even a surplus, right? I mean, we've seen that 4.2 to 19, right, in terms of last year, right? Yeah. And we're still seeing, commodities are still relatively strong. Income tax and unemployment is still at, all-time lows. So the factors that drove last year's budget to move into a bigger surplus haven't changed materially this year yet, right? Now they may, right? Which is, why we might see it still be a deficit, right?
I've just done the numbers, and if you take the difference between what they projected and what eventuated, and you apply that to this year as well, assume that they get that same boost, it's actually going to move them exactly out of that deficit. So very sneaky. Very, very sneaky.
Now, what's interesting about all this, before we dive in and look at the specific policies within this budget that are targeting economic growth and then the likely impact on economic growth, I think the important thing to highlight here is that the Australian budget still really has a structural deficit, right? So we've talked about, we've had this, year 2022-23 surplus. We may get another surplus this year, right? Depending on ongoing economic, sort of conditions. But it doesn't change the fact that over forward estimates, we've still got a structural deficit. Now, what is a structural deficit? What does that mean? Because I think that goes to some sense, particularly as we get into talking later on about like external stability, for example, as well.
Yeah. So as with anything in this course, you can often separate things into either cyclical or structural factors. And just like with external stability, you have a structural current account deficit. So even though we're celebrating some of those cyclical surpluses we've had in the current account surplus, we understand that in the long term, we usually are we're set up in a way that puts us in that deficit. So Ron was talking about the structural deficit of the budget. And so what that means is there are certain factors within our economy which set us up to persistently always be in a small deficit position. Now, there were two reasons which I think we wanted to outline here. The first one is that and I've been hearing this since I was in high school, that we in Australia, we have an aging population. All right? And so we've got, essentially what we have is we have a declining working age population, but we've got more people outside of that working age population who will need assistance and government spending to support them post-retirement.
And just to give you a number on that, okay, just to indicate this, right? So at the moment, okay, we've got this old age dependency ratio. And so basically it looks at the number of people that are aged 65 years and older, right, per 100 people aged 15 to 64. So it's basically looking at like how many people are in the workforce, or likely to be in the working age population at least, that are able to support people that are over 65 years old, right? And that's projected to increase from 27 this year to 31 in the next decade. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot. Like 27 to 31, it's only like four
people,
right?
Yeah.
But it shows the overarching trend, right? Which is aging population, and it means that at the end of the day, we've got less people working and tax revenue to support more people that are now retired, right? And so I think that's definitely one of the big factors with this aging population that's going to continue to place long-term pressure on the budget. What's the second one?
The second one is then, I guess, if we're not looking at it from the spending side, we're looking at it from the taxation revenue side. We're looking at the fact that we have, unfortunately, low productivity growth, and we've had this for some time.
Yeah.
I remember in previous budgets that we've done, we've looked at the fact that business investment has just been completely weak and it hasn't picked up. COVID killed it, tried to bring it back, didn't work. The government's had heavily expansionary policies towards business investment. And it unfortunately hasn't materialized. And so what we're getting essentially is very little growth in terms of our multi-factor productivity.
Yeah.
Labor productivity is quite stable, but not really going up.
Yeah.
And so unfortunately, if we're not able to produce more and earn more incomes, unfortunately, we're just going to be stuck in a situation where we're spending more money and not earning as much tax.
And particularly if you've got, if we've got that aging population, we sort of need the people that are working to arguably be more productive to support the people that are no longer. And if that's flat, well, we can see that we've got a problem. So let's now park that. I think that's a big picture, right, for a moment. It's a little bit of like we've got some political stuff going on that's shaping this. We've got, some structural deficits over the long term that are still going to be here. What does this budget, though, do for economic growth? Now, before we look at that specifically in terms of the policies, I think, the important thing to sort of consider is that, generally speaking, when you're taught often economic growth, right, you're often taught that the objective is 3 to 4%.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Now, is that what this budget is setting out to achieve?
No. And you know what I also want to point on that is that aside from that COVID V-shaped recovery, when have we actually genuinely had 3 to 4% growth in the past 10 years? Like basically never.
That's right. I mean, we're lucky to sit somewhere in the 1 to 3, right? Really. I mean, that's generally like, okay, we're doing okay. And so I think that's the thing to highlight here. When you're evaluating the budget and its impact on an economic issue, ultimately you are evaluating it to the extent to which it's going to achieve or support the achievement of an objective, right? Now, what I wouldn't be recommending is you're analysing this on the basis that we're going to get to 3 to 4. Partly because the budget itself is saying, well, they're not even forecasting that. In their own forecast, they're saying, look, we're expecting economic growth to slow to 1.5% in 23-24, and then maybe strengthen to 2.25 in 24-25. So in many respects, what we're trying to look at here is, okay, well, what is the budget's likelihood of even just achieving what they're saying they're hoping to achieve, rather than necessarily holding it to a 3 to 4%, because it's just so unlikely.
Yeah, and I just want to touch on that. I think if you could actually make that point, in an essay or a short answer response, I think it'd be a very, very positive thing for you to actually recognise that maybe the objectives that have previously been set in your textbooks are probably a little bit outdated. They don't account for the secular stagnation that we've had in recent times. And so it'd be nice to maybe just make a point. Yes, we understand that textbook says 3 to 4%, but as Rowan was saying, when you look at what the governments have been budgeting and forecasting, we're nowhere near that. And so if they can get close to that, I think we could say that that's actually been fairly successful.
That's right, exactly. So let's dive in. Obviously, we've got a situation where the government's saying economic growth is slowing, and so their objective is to try to support it to stay really above the 1.5%, right, over this course of this year. We've got a mildly expansionary budget, so we can argue that the stance is already going to be mildly supporting economic growth, okay? And we're saying mildly because, as Terry said, 0.5% of GDP, very small. What, though, are some of the specific policies that this budget is really looking at to try to create economic growth?
All right, so the first one we've got here is what's called the National Reconstruction Fund. That pledges $15 billion to essentially investing back into some of that manufacturing which we've eroded in recent times. Within the manufacturing investment, they've got 7 priority areas. So this is across things like renewables and low emissions technology, medical science, transport, value add in agriculture, forestry and fisheries sectors, resources, defense capability, and enabling capability. So I kind of like the direction we're going with here. I feel like we're playing more to our strengths, what we've probably already got a bit of a history in. But for me personally, though, I'm a very big numbers guy. I like to say how much money is being spent. So when I look at 15 billion and it's across 7 different areas, how much money is really going into
one particular area. That's right. Now, look, so I think that's definitely a point of analysis that you can certainly raise. Like, okay, is it as significant? Even though they're saying it's the largest peacetime or one of the largest peacetime manufacturing investments, it definitely gets split. I think the other thing here to think about, right, and this is just in thinking about how does this impact economic growth, is that it's really trying to do two things, right? In the shorter term, it's providing an increase in aggregate demand through government expenditure, but in the longer term, it's also designed to increase the productive capacity and the supply chain and the supply side of Australia to support long-term sustainable growth, right? So that is a bit of a short-term, but there's also a long-term implication here for this. Now, there's some other things that this budget is doing for economic growth. They've got an industry growth program. They're spending just short of $400 million, $392 million to support SMEs, so Australian small to medium-sized businesses, to commercialise their ideas and grow operations. So part of this is a recognition that SMEs are actually one of the largest employers in the country. They employ almost not quite. I think it's just over 60% of employees across the country. And I think there's a recognition that, we're needing to continue to invest in that. And the hope is that by doing so, you've got, new companies commercializing, right, creating more economic activity, but also then the longer term effect is on employment.
Yeah, so I actually like the synergy that we have between these two policies, right? So you've got the National Reconstruction Fund probably looking at a more broader industry scale, but then within those same industries, you've got the industry growth program for those SMEs operating in that. So you're looking at the big picture and you've got the small picture as well.
Which is nice to see, definitely. Now, a couple of other things that we've got here is they've also furthermore got a critical technologies industry investment. It's $100 million for the growth of technology, particularly quantum and AI. And so this is again a little bit of future proofing, looking at these are opportunities that are going to significantly transform not just Australia but the world. And that I think is again really feeding into the prior two sort of policies, right? You can see that there's really been a clear strategy around it.
Yeah, and I also just want to point out again what I was saying earlier as well. Like we actually have identified and done a better job of picking what we have a bit more of a comparative advantage in. So Australia actually, when we talk about manufacturing, often gets a bit of a bad rep in terms of we're not very good at it, but we actually are good in certain high-tech niches. And so for things like quantum and AI, I think if we already have the capabilities in that, putting more money in that will generally just be quite supportive of that.
So look, one other thing to highlight, and then we're going to do some analysis here, right, is I think another thing that the budget's got is it's also looked at, again, further small business support. Like I think recognising the impact that COVID has still had and is still playing out for a lot of businesses. They've identified ongoing, being able to support cash flow, right, by being able to write off asset purchases. So again, you might remember during COVID, there was some very generous asset write-off provisions that was implemented. They were implemented where you could, up to $150,000, right, write off the value of an asset, which would reduce a business's taxable income, essentially, and therefore the tax that they would have to pay. Now, the theory behind this is it's designed...
It's great.
Yeah.
It's a great theory.
Yeah, it's a great theory, right? The theory is it's designed to encourage businesses to invest. Right, which is Terry already made a comment earlier.
Yeah, well, I'm getting ready. Like, I just want to say, like, the fact that they still have this, obviously it hasn't worked, right? Because they've just kept going with it. It's really sad to see the numbers haven't backed it up.
Yeah.
When you look at business investment, I was looking the other day, the contribution towards GDP is less than 1% of business investment. Like, it just hasn't picked up. And look, you gotta appreciate that they haven't given up. But me seeing this here is, I don't know, for me, like, I think you gotta try something else.
And it's also challenging because business investment, if we look at very briefly the comment you made earlier about multi-factor productivity also remaining fairly low, right? Like usually the driver of multi-factor productivity growth in Australia has been through like capital deepening, right? It's through capital investments, which is exactly what this is designed to support, but businesses aren't doing it. And so it also goes to feed into like the bigger problem that we have with productivity. Now, the one final quick thing to mention here, and then the analysis, is that they've also implemented a 5-year national cultural policy plan to try to revive the arts and entertainment sector. Yeah. So that's $286 million in funding. And again, a lot of this is still trying to deal with the consequences of COVID.
Yeah, because I was just going to say, because they got completely wiped out. They were one of the hardest done in terms of the increases to unemployment levels during COVID, and so it's obviously going to take a fair bit of stimulus to get it back on its feet.
Right. So now let's do some analysis, right? We've looked at big picture, we've looked at some specific policies that you can mention in your extended responses for economic growth. What is the analysis in terms of the likely impact of this budget on the economic issue, and what are some of the limitations in here? So I guess let's dive in. I think there's a really good way to start with this, Terry, and that's around conflict in objectives, right?
Right.
We haven't spoken about it yet, but I think that's a big driving factor here. What am I referring to?
Yeah, so I think the one that's on everyone's minds is obviously the fact that we haven't had price stability in recent times. Like I highlighted earlier, we had a peak of 7.8% inflation at the end of 2022. It's now gone down. It's actually started to slow down a little bit. It's potentially reached its peak. We're down at 6%. But obviously, if we know the RBA's got that 2 to 3% target range on average over a period of time, then that's not where we want to be. And so there's obviously that trade-off here that we recognise that if we want to slow inflation down, we need to implement a more contractionary. I mean, monetary policy definitely has been very, very contractionary. Fiscal has probably been, we talked about mildly expansionary, but in a way that's probably a bit less, being less expansionary.
It is.
That's their
right.
Yeah, that's their contractionary stance, if you will. And so they've kind of opted to do a bit of a trade-off here and sacrifice and accept a bit of lower growth. I think the figure we had was 1.5% for this year, in the hopes of, I guess, bringing that inflation back down.
So a key part of your analysis really, I think, does need to be when you're looking at the budget's impact on economic growth, considering the policy conflict here, okay? Because clearly the driving factor is that, they've really gone great. We've got to find a way to still encourage economic growth. That's going to be important, right? We want to keep unemployment low. We want to keep economic growth ticking, but we can't do so in a way that's going to overheat the economy. Now, the challenge with this, okay, is that there is a really high likelihood that Australia is going to enter into a per capita recession. Now, basically, that's when you have a situation where the population is growing quicker than economic growth, okay? So when you then look at it at a per capita level, the economy is going backwards. And so I think that's one of the realities that we have. Now, when you get a per capita recession, usually what happens is you get an erosion in living standards, okay? So it's a tension, right? And it's really a bit of a balancing act that the budget and the government is taking right now as to whether or not they're going to balance it right and land on the side of just getting enough economic growth to then not also cause inflation to continue to kick. And hopefully they will, okay? But, remains to be seen, okay? So do you have any other sort of, analysis that we can add to this?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly express a bit of sympathy and add to what you were saying about the fact that they have to balance between, meeting that, maintaining that living standards. But I think, it almost feels like in both situations, taking the per capita recession or just leaving inflation to go, to not really treat it. Both of those are basically going to erode your living standards anyway.
Right.
So it's almost like saying, well, pick the lesser of two evils.
Yeah.
So I do want to express my sympathy for the federal government in this case, where they've been stuck behind a rock and stuck between a rock and a hard place. It's quite difficult, which I guess kind of leads us into our next consideration, which is the political factors.
Yeah.
Right? And so obviously, Parliament itself is a very difficult place to be in. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, so look, I think that the big thing, and there's been a big sense with Labor for many, many years, and I think it's probably been Liberals' almost main election campaign, right, has been that you can't trust Labor with your money.
Well, we know
right?
that ad. Everyone remembers that ad.
Yeah, right. It's a very, very famous, political ad, and it goes to the heart that, Labor hadn't been able to have a surplus for many, many years, and there was a real sense that Liberals had a great reputation, at least in the past, right, for being good managers of the economy, and Labor not so much. You'd want Labor in to create social change. You'd want Liberals in to, to create financial management, right? That was the big picture consensus. Now, I think as a result, there is a sense here, right, that, a big part of and this goes to the conflict in objectives as well, is that we've obviously ratcheted up the government debt over the course of COVID. And so a big part of what the Labor has been trying to do is to say, hey, we're going to strengthen the budget, which is really an acknowledgement of external stability, of trying to get government debt down. But it's also been a position of going, well, we also want to really solidify our financial management chops, right? So that for future elections, we've got a good opportunity of getting re-elected, but also really taking steam out of really Liberals' probably most one of Liberals' more effective election campaigns. Now, in all of this, I think the underlying other criticism that exists is that this budget is not really one that does a lot structurally, right? Short of, yes, we've got the big investment in industry, right? In terms of the 15 billion. It's not one that really tries to address productivity or any of the other major sort of structural reforms that have been needed. And again, there is a sense that politically, the sense is that Labor's been wanting to come in and really try to have a really smooth as possible first term, right? So that they can get elected, hopefully with a bigger mandate in second term to be able to do this. But at some point, it feels like some of these things get kicked a bit further down the road, right?
Yeah. So I just want to echo what you were saying, Rowan. I think it almost feels like that this budget has been very heavily influenced by a party who's not even in power, which is the pressure and, if I may, the jawboning from the Liberal Party themselves, almost speaking them into having a budget which is only quite mildly expansionary and not really looking to spend. And so I would like, they always talk about, you shouldn't get too political in economics, but I think this is a very valid point about economic policy in general, which is that it is very, very heavily influenced by political factors. And it would be great if, as a student, you're able to unpack some of those things that Rowan was saying, because a lot of the time, when I look at an essay, a student will just write, "Oh, this is thus limited by political constraints." Well, what constraints? Tell us. You have the knowledge here. It's a wonderful breakdown that Rowan just had about the Labor's predicament.
Yeah. So look, just to quickly wrap up, right? What we've really unpacked here is we've got mildly expansionary budget, right? That is trying to walk a balancing line between promoting economic growth, limiting a per capita recession, but also then trying to deal with the conflict in objectives. And those objectives are predominantly price stability, but certainly also a little bit of external stability. And underneath all of that, we have a challenge of these real political limitations that have really driven the outcome that we see in this budget, and really probably the budget outcomes that we see in Labor's first term, right? Assuming that they may be back for a second term. So if you have any questions about this budget and its analysis and the impact on economic growth, let us know in the comments below. Love to dive in and discuss more on it. Additionally, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, because this is our first video in a series of analysis of the budget. So we're going to have future episodes diving into the impact of the budget on inflation, the environment, employment, distribution of income and wealth, and more. So stay tuned for those episodes. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next episode.